Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our third plenary talk by Dr. Carlos Marichal, who will be talking about the role of the Spanish and Portuguese America in the emerging world economy in the 16th to 18th centuries. Dr. Marichal is a professor of economic history at El Colegio de Mexico. He has published widely on the economic and financial history of Latin America. He's the author or editor of some 20 books in Spanish on Latin American economic history. His book, A Century of Debt Crisis in Latin America, From Independence to the Great Depression, remains the standard reference work on this subject. He's also the author of Bankruptcy of Empire, Mexican Silver and the Wars Between Spain, Britain, and France, which received the Alice Hanson Jones Biennial Prize of the Economic History Association of the United States as an outstanding book on North American economic history. Dr. Marichal, let's start. I will share my screen.
You can see me, no?
Yes.
Okay, well, let me begin by saying hello to everybody and repeat what you just said. I'm a professor at the Colegio de Mexico. I work on economic history mainly. I've been teaching it for a long time and doing work in that area. This is a very interesting course with many very distinguished economic historians and economists. And I think it's a great initiative to be able to connect with so many people from all over. And the University of Pennsylvania should be congratulated on doing this and opening up to Latin America as well as North America. Well, let me begin by mentioning the general subject or title of this talk. It's Early Globalization, the Role of Spanish America and Portuguese Brazil in the Emerging World Economy, 16th to the 18th centuries. And now we can mention the specific themes to be covered in this class. And you can project, if you want, the first PowerPoint there. The first question to be addressed is why the Indies, Vasco da Gama and Columbus, and the birth of early globalization. I don't know if you're seeing the PowerPoint now or not.
Yes.
Or, well, I don't see it, but I'll just go ahead. So we'll focus on that question, the discovery, and particularly the importance of export commodities. In the second place, now I see it. We're going to be talking about gold and silver mines of America and the role in world monetary circulation from the early 16th century. In other words, what was the role of the gold and silver from the Americas, which was the main exports from the 16th century to the early 19th century? And the Americas were the main producers of metallic currency for the world from the early 16th century. A third subject is the institutions of the old colonial regime, particularly the Organization of Trade and Mercantile Associations, the consulados of the merchant consulates of the Americas, which were based on European models. A fourth subject is early tropical exports, not silver and gold, those were the minerals, but also from the 16th century, we have the exports of sugar, tobacco, and dyes, and the slave trade. So we will be talking a lot about export commodities. And then finally, we'll be talking about not export commodities, but silver and gold as instruments of power politics from the 16th to the 18th centuries for the Spanish imperial government and the Portuguese governments over 3 centuries. Now, I'll begin to discuss the question of early globalization. I think this is an important question. Early globalization is a term or concept that was invented recently to help describe the diverse connections between the relatively distant economies in the Ancien regime, which was characterized by mercantile capitalism, previous to the flourishing of the Industrial Revolution and modern capitalism. So we're talking basically about a period of mercantile capitalism. The connections of early globalization, essentially between the 16th and 18th century, can be described as processes of exchange, both of goods and of money. Now, I emphasize money because we'll be talking a lot about silver and gold. Money, whether metallic currency or bills of exchange, were the key instruments used to settle accounts of trade and also of profit from trade. Money, basically in silver and gold coins, most of which were coming from the Americas from the early 16th century, fulfilled the classic functions of serving as a unit of account, as a medium of exchange, as well as a physical and real symbol of wealth, of accumulation of wealth derived from commerce in commodities and other related economic activities. In this respect, it is important to consider the importance of commodities and of money in the personal and world views of the greatest explorers of the 1490s, Columbus and Vasco da Gama. You can project the text, Why the Indies? In fact, their efforts, the efforts of Columbus and Vasco da Gama, to discover little-known oceanic routes to faraway lands and fundamentally to connect west and east was driven by the desire not just to discover, but to facilitate trade and stimulate wealth accumulation, while also aiming to support efforts by the church and religious efforts to spread the faith among peoples little known by Europeans. Now, in the case of Columbus, we can note that he was bent on reaching the Indies. He didn't know he was going to arrive to the Americas. He wanted to go to the Spice Islands of South Asia. So that's why when he gets to the West Indies, he calls them the Indies, Las Indias, no? And that's why we will later get the term Indians, no? Which is rather paradoxical because American native Indians were not Indians, but they received that name because of Columbus, who thought that he had arrived at the Indies, at the extreme islands of the eastern part of Asia. He never knew that he had not arrived at Asia. He thought the Americas was part of Asia until his death. He made 4 trips to the Caribbean, and he still believed that. Now, why did Columbus want to get to the Indies? He was raised in Genoa, and he was therefore a member of one of the wealthiest cities in the Mediterranean based on trade with Asia. The caravans of Asia would arrive to Constantinople and bring pepper and cinnamon and silks and ceramics and all kinds of precious dyes from Asia. And in Constantinople, which was before Byzantium and would be later Istanbul, the merchants of Venice and of Genoa would arrive, buy these products, and take them to Europe. And therefore, Venice, Florence, and Genoa were the seats of early mercantile capitalism. And of the earliest banks, by the way, the Banco de San Giorgio of Genoa is the oldest and longest lasting bank in the world, founded in 1400. Columbus was brought up in this great trading city and learned his navigation from the great Genoese naval captains and merchants and navigators and map makers. The other great discoverer was Vasco da Gama, Portuguese. He was brought up in the sea towns of southern Portugal, and you can now pass on to the Spanish exploration. Oh no, sorry. Why the Indies, Vasco da Gama? Okay, well, and he was brought up in the sea towns of southern Portugal, and then later in Lisbon. Now, what was the characteristic of Portugal at that time? They were developing trade with Africa, no? And rounding the Cape of Good Hope. That's what Vasco da Gama did in 1497. He was the first to round the Cape of Good Hope of South Africa and then surround the Indian Ocean to Calcutta. You can go on to the map, Iberia projects. Well, here we have a map of the first map of the Americas. You see the Die Neue Welt, the new world, Novus Orbus, the new orb, and then you see the Caribbean. Cuba appears there, and this is a very early map of Americas. As you can see, it's not very precise, and on the other side you have India and Cathay. Let's go on to the next one. Here is a map also which shows South America, and as you can see, America appears as the title. Why? Because of Americo Vespucci, because Waldseemüller, when he did his Mappa Mundi, decided to put in a little America there. And from that time on, the Americas are known either as Las Indias, the Indies, or as America. No? That's the first use of the term America. And this is an interesting subject. Now we can go on to Spanish, Portuguese exploration. Well, Iberia projects it, that's right. Now, I was saying Vasco da Gama goes off, gets to India, and then the other Portuguese explorers go along this green line to Malacca, to Indonesia, and then from there to China. Now, this is the same time that Columbus has gone to the Americas. So you can see we're beginning to have early globalization, the connection by oceans between all parts of the world. No? And this is a very significant moment, that precisely 1492, 1500, 1520. No? In the case of Vasco da Gama and the other explorers, going to Asia was interesting to gain access to the spice trade, precisely what Columbus wanted. But Vasco da Gama was making it directly around Africa to get the pepper and cinnamon and the spice trade, basically luxury goods of little weight and high value. We have to remember that the ships that were traveling here were between 250 and 300 tons at most in size. So they had to carry very valuable products, but of low weight. You wouldn't be transporting coal or wheat in the 16th century. You're transporting only luxury goods. And the Portuguese were beginning to undercut the Italians in terms of lower costs of marine transport. And they also avoided excessive reliance on Arab merchants, although this is a subject now heavily researched. There's a lot of interest in how the Arab merchants were involved in the Indian Ocean in all of this early globalization period. Now, let's focus on the search for valuable commodities from the New World. And let's stop a moment to consider how the Spaniards and Portuguese in Brazil aimed to promote trade and wealth accumulation in the new American territories. The first stage of conquest in the Americas was quite simply by plunder of local Indian societies, of the Aztec and Inca empires. The second stage consisted in submission of native peoples as laborers and tributaries, workforce as agricultural laborers in construction and mines and transport, as well as servants. In addition, both the state and church designed methods to extract taxes from the native people all over the Americas as a second source of wealth. But that wealth, the taxes, basically for the crown and the Catholic Church. And in both cases, the Spaniards and Portuguese had already learned how to conquer and submit peoples. This in the Iberian Peninsula during the age of reconquest of the Arab kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula. As you know, between the 10th, 11th century and the 15th century and the final submission of Granada, the Spaniards and the Portuguese were conquering Arab kingdoms in Spain. And they took that model to the Americas, how to conquer and submit peoples. Well, now we can go on to the next one. this moment of discovery of the Americas, some call it the encounter of the Americas, allows for the beginning of early globalization. But the one question that is raised recently is, when did early modern globalization start? Of course, from the 1520s and the discovery of the Americas, and from the trip of Vasco da Gama to India, we have the early globalization. But Flynn and Giraldez, who are economists from California, argue that it was in 1571 when the first Manila galleons began crossing from the Philippines to Mexico on an annual basis that we have really, truly global trade. In other words, transatlantic trade and trans-Pacific trade. Economic historians Williamson and O'Rourke, who are the major experts for this period, argue that from that time, from the mid-16th century, the value of world trade expanded and reached an average increase of close to 1% per year. Now, that was something new. This has never happened, that increase of 1% per year. On the other hand, they argue that a process of price convergency of the commodity prices has not been detected. And this has a lot to do with the variation in the prices of luxury goods. These lightweight and high-value goods, such as silk, tea, spices, silver, gold, dyes, varied very heavily. The prices were highly volatile. So Williamson and O'Rourke argue that there was not really a deep integration between markets in the 16th century. Early globalization is not yet integration between markets. It's connections. It's connections, but it's not really integration. No? And so this is an interesting subject. It's much debated now among economic historians. How much integration was there really in early globalization? From this time, what we find is that there was a series of natural resources that began to be important for early globalization. And the goods that were found in the Americas, the natural resources that were of importance, were mainly silver, gold, different goods like tobacco, cocoa, chocolate, different dyes, cochineal, Brazil wood, logwood, precious woods, certain drugs like quinine. There are not many products from the Americas, but they're important. The most important were silver and gold, obviously. No? What is the importance there? Well, basically, the conquerors of the Americas, the Spanish and the Portuguese, who set up the colonists, wanted to get rich quick. So they wanted, above all, to find valuable natural resources, silver and gold. No? And Columbus mentions the word gold about 200 times in the journals of his voyages and other texts. So this was very important for him. Now we can go on to the next slide, I think. Well, this is what we've been talking about here. The different products, gold and silver, tobacco, cocoa and chocolate, pau-Brazil, no? And these are valuable commodities. These are the first export commodities coming from the Americas. No? And the Spaniards were particularly interested in the silver and gold. And but before they found silver and gold, they found that in the Americas there was also another kind of money. It was chocolate beans. In the Aztec Empire, the money was chocolate beans. Now that may sound a little strange, but in all countries in this period, there were many other instruments, monetary instruments, among them, in the case of the Aztec Empire, it was chocolate. When Michael and Sophie Coe, Yale University professors, anthropologists, and authors of A History of Chocolate, note that the Emperor Moctezuma was a kind of pre-capitalist monopolist and he accumulated all the money. According to the reports of the Spaniards and research by the Coes, it has been established that the Aztec Empire, Moctezuma had 960 million chocolate beans in his palace on the edge of the main Mexican square, the Zócalo. Now that's a kind of an amazing question. It's 960 million, well, not beans, they would be dollars, say today, no? So the emperor really controlled all the money. And Coe writes, these depositories of local money shared some of the characteristics of Fort Knox on the one hand, and of Louis XIV's wine cellars on the others. In other words, what happened? The chocolate beans was a money, but it was also a luxury beverage. And the emperors and everybody in the Aztec elite drank the chocolate. It also served as soldiers' pay. Why? Because the Aztec emperor needed to pay his soldiers, and he paid them with his money, with chocolate beans. What happens is that Cortés finds that there is a monetary system in the Aztec Empire. It's not what we are accustomed to, because we think about silver and gold, metallic currency at that period, as the money. But the Aztec Empire was very sophisticated, commercially speaking. There were many markets, and they used this as their medium of exchange, as their money. However, the Spaniards were less interested in chocolate than in metallic minerals, especially gold and silver. You have an image here of the Hispaniola and of Indians getting gold dust out of mines at the superficial level in Hispaniola, which was one of the first islands found. And Columbus and everybody else of the Spaniards who arrived in the West Indies wanted gold dust. They wanted gold. Now, these minerals came both from surface deposits and underground deposits. In the case of Spanish America, of Mexico and Peru, the gold and silver was found in mines mainly. No, we can go to gold and silver. The search for universal money. Well, why do I call about it? Why do I talk about universal money? The circulation of metallic currency was the dominant form of money in the 16th century, plus a certain amount of trade bills. But there wasn't paper money. The Chinese had invented paper money, but it had disappeared by 1540. So in the rest of the world, it was basically coins, and basically silver and gold. So there was a huge world demand for silver and gold to supply the monetary system everywhere, whether it be in Europe or in the Ottoman Empire, or in India, or in China, and obviously in the Americas as well. Now, the Spaniards knew that there was a great demand, and they were interested in silver and gold because it was wealth. So if you could find silver and gold, you became rich. You became rich fast. No? So they began looking for silver mines, and they were so fortunate that they found a lot of them. They found them in the mountains of the American hemisphere. Particularly of the great mountain ranges from north to south, as described by Professor Villaverde in the first class. There are two great ranges that run down from the Rockies to the end of the Andes in Chile, and through them are veins of silver and copper, some gold, zinc, and other minerals. But the Spaniards were interested above all in silver. And they began finding it, and they found it above all from the 1540s in both in Mexico and in Bolivia. These mines became the wealthiest mines, the richest mines in the world in this early period, and they supported both the Spanish and the Portuguese empires. Now, the first, the greatest mine of all time was Potosí. Potosí is a city in Bolivia. It was called Alto Peru in the 16th century. This is an engraving from the 16th century. Now, this mountain that you see there is still there. It was and is the greatest silver lode in the world. No? Today, it's been largely mined out after 5 centuries. No? But there's still silver in there. They're still going in there. There was even a project to explode, to set dynamite and blow up the top part of the mine and go in directly for the silver. But it's such a symbol, you know, it's a symbol, it's the Bolivian symbol of Bolivian nationality that project was stopped. No? But anyway, in the 1540s, Potosí began to become a great silver mine producer. And by the early 17th century, Potosí had a population of 150,000 people. Well, that's as much as Mexico. It's bigger than Madrid and most of the European cities at that time. People came from everywhere, from Europe, from the Americas, from China. They came to Potosí to find silver. You know, it's the silver rush instead of the gold rush. And they arrived there and established them and began drilling holes and mines into this great mountain and taking the silver out and then refining it and then sending it off to by mules. It took a lot of mules to Lima, to Peru, and then by ship to Europe. And Potosí continued to be an extraordinary source of silver for a long time. We can go on to the next one. Potosí in the 18th century continues to be a great mining center. No? And this is a map. There are lots of these illustrations. For these maps and illustrations, the Library of Congress is a great source. It's a great source. You should go to historical maps of the Library of Congress. Now, you might think that Potosí doesn't exist now, but if we go on to the next photo, you will see it. This is Potosí today. Now, you see the city below the great silver mine. No? And as I said, it still is exploited by the silver miners on a much smaller scale. But this is to suggest that a story from the 1540s to the present continues to be of great importance. Now, how much silver and how much gold was taken out of the Americas between the 16th and the 18th century? Here we have a graph which gives you an idea of the trends over 2 centuries. This could not have been constructed until about 10 years ago when John Tepask and Kendall Brown brought together all the information. As you may notice in that graph, the first stage of the 17th century, it's Peru that produces all this silver that's going around the world. And it's funneling, it's going into to fuel monetary circulation around the world. And in the 17th century, it's Peru and Potosí, which are the major leaders. But from about 1700, it's Mexico that becomes the great silver producer. No? And the sums are enormous. I mean, it's about, in the 18th century, it's about 30 million pesos. And that's a huge sum. There was no other export commodity in the world between the 16th and 18th century equivalent to the silver exports of Mexico in the 18th century, no? Or of Peru in the 17th century. But then you'll see a red dot line there, and that's gold. And that's gold from Brazil. Brazil became the great gold producer from 1680 onwards, and continues during the 18th century. There's an interesting story behind this which has not been studied. The silver mainly went to Spain and to France, to continental Europe, but the gold went mostly from Brazil to Portugal, and then from there to England and Holland. So one of the reasons why Spain and France went onto a bimetallic system with dominance of silver is because they were receiving silver from the early 17th century, whereas Great Britain and Holland, via Portugal, were receiving more gold. And I would suggest as a hypothesis, but nobody has studied this, that Britain went on to the gold standard basically because of the gold that came from Brazil, because Brazil was producing about 80% of the gold in the world in the 18th century. So that was the source of British gold. Now, how was the silver and gold produced? We can go on to the next graph. Basically, silver and gold were minted. These are, you can call them factories of money, the money factories, and they were set up all over Spanish America and Brazil. The map, you'll have to just accept it. You can, we can send you later a larger version, but basically there are 10 mints established around Spanish America and Brazil. These are monopolies set up by the governments, and it's there the money that is actually printed up, actually stamped. No, the silver is brought to the mint, and there by mules, whether it's the Spanish America or Brazil, it was brought by mules. No, and there's brought to the mint, and there they have these machines which stamp the silver or the gold and turn it into coin. And that coin is then put on ships and shipped off to Europe, or alternatively to China or to the Far East, no? Depending on where it's transatlantic or trans-Pacific trade, which, since these were the main markets for the coin. Now we can see the next image. We have here an image of a silver peso, which was minted at Potosi in the 17th century. Potosi was producing huge amounts of these silver pesos. No? Now, this money was the universal money of the Ancien regime. These silver pesos circulated all over Europe, and they went to the rest of the world. You may see from the images on the left side, you have a coin which has the Lion of Castile and the castle below it. No, the Castile means land of castles. No, and this is, the money is a symbol of the sovereignty of the emperor, the Habsburg Empire, Philip IV in this case. No, on the right hand side you have two columns. Those columns are minted on the coin, and they are the columns of Hercules. No, from the Roman times, from the Greek times, ancient Greek times, it was said that at Gibraltar, the opening from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic was where the columns of Hercules were. So it's symbolic. The opening to the Atlantic and to the Americas was taken by the Spaniards as symbol of a new world that found across the Atlantic. And those columns, you will note, are important later. You'll see them because they become part of the dollar symbol. No? The dollar symbol has two columns and an S through them, but we'll get to that later. No? In any case, these coins had enormous importance as universal currency, and therefore are part of this essential story of early globalization. But making the coins was not a simple story. Let's go on to the next one. It was a technical process. It was complex. And the mints, they had to, well, before getting to the mints, the silver is taken out of the mines and then refined, you know, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But before that, we should say that there is a technical process to producing money, you know, just like central banks today have technical processes of producing both coin and paper money. Well, in the 17th century, it's necessary to find out how you can produce the highest quality, high value money that will be respected worldwide. I mean, if the coins are not high quality, they will not circulate well. And the Spaniards and the Portuguese began developing high quality technical methods of producing money at the mint after the refining process. Now we can see the next image, and you'll see a metal expert working to produce possibilities of combining silver with copper. that a little copper helps the silver become stronger. And so the coins could contain a little bit of copper or a little bit of nickel, and they were looking to produce high quality coins. And again, let me insist, all over the world, these coins, the American coins from Mexico, Peru, and so forth, and the gold coins from Brazil were used worldwide. So this is universal currency. Now let's go into the next image. Here we see the actual refining process of the silver. What happens with the silver that comes out of the mines is it's sent to places called haciendas de beneficio, which are refineries. This one is in Zacatecas in Mexico, where in the 18th century, Mexico becomes the great silver producer. About 70% of all world silver was produced in Mexico in the 18th century. And for the first half of the 19th century also, Mexico was the great silver producer. And so all the silver coins in the world, whether they were silver pesos or smaller coins, were coming out of the silver mines. And basically what they would take the silver from the mines and they would bring them to this silver refinery, put them into these kind of pools of water where the minerals were trampled by horse and mule and people, workers, until the earth and was washed out and the minerals were left. And then they put in mercury. Mercury fixes on silver. And so they could see from that where the silver was of all the minerals. These silver refineries were all over the Americas. This was the way it was done for 3 centuries. And the mercury was brought from different places. The main source was Almaden in Spain, which are the mercury mines. There are very few mercury mines in the world. Almaden is one. There is another mine in Austria called Istria, where some mines, and then there's a mercury mine in Peru, in Huancavelica. And so these are the sources of mercury, which allows an efficient process of amalgamation of silver and refinery, and refining of minerals, of silver minerals. Actually, if you follow the curves of the silver, of the mercury imports, you get a pretty good sensation of how much silver was being produced, but that's not automatic. Now, let's go on to the circulation of silver pesos as universal money of the Ancien Regime, 16th to 18th centuries. The control of the circulation of silver and its double condition as means of payment and export commodity proved to be a fundamental instrument that ensured merchants a preeminent position in the economy and society of Spanish America. Now, these merchants are silver merchants, but they're also participate in other commodities. But this is the most important. The merchants got together and formed associations known as consulados, which governed all aspects of trade. Now, what's interesting about the consulados is that it tells us something about mercantile capitalism in the long run. Why consulados? Well, that expression comes from consulates or consulados of the Italian consulado, the Venetian consulado, the Genoese consulado. The old mercantile associations of the medieval era, where merchants got together, and they actually governed the cities of Florence, of Genoa, of Venice, these merchants, served as the primary organization of mercantile capitalism. And this was copied later by the Spaniards, who set up consulados in Bilbao, in Burgos, and all kinds of regulations. There is where you get beginning having a regulation of trade. It comes from the consulates. That's where regulation of trade comes from. And it's not a state function, it's a private function of the mercantile associations. So we have this interesting feature of early globalization, which is that the state is involved in different aspects, but private actors, these mercantile actors, you can call them mercantile syndicates, in all of Europe operated into the control and regulation of trade, and they had their own tribunals. No, so all of people who are interested in institutional history should look at the consulados and the regulation of trade. Everything was regulated in one way or another, but in the old regime, in the ancien regime, most of this is done by private actors, whether it's mining associations or mercantile associations, or even the church, which is regulating credit. No? It's not the state. Every association has its own possibility of regulating. So the old states of the ancien regime are a curious combination of jurisdictions, of institutional jurisdictions, various ones, which are different from what's going to happen with liberalism in the 19th century. These commercial associations were set up in Europe and then copied in Spanish America, in Veracruz, in Cartagena, in Portobelo, in Acapulco. There were consulates in Havana and Caracas, in Buenos Aires. And all of these consulates were essential to control the large flows of silver. Am I okay with the time?
Yes, you have half an hour.
Okay. Now, how did they control the trade? Why was it so monopolistic? Well, this is largely a function of the fleets. The trade across the Atlantic was conducted on great fleets, protected by the Spanish Armada on the one hand, or the Portuguese Armada on the other, when they were going to Brazil. And this was to protect them against the pirates. And the British and the French and the Dutch were trying to get their hands on the silver and the gold that was crossing the Atlantic. No? And so they had to have these fleets to protect themselves. A single ship crossing the Atlantic would be a very easy victim of any pirates or privateers of the British, like Drake or Hawkins, or of the French privateers or the Dutch privateers. So these fleets would travel basically once a year. They would leave in the spring from Seville and Cadiz, or from Lisbon, and they would cross the Atlantic, and they would arrive to the ports in the Americas. And there, the local merchants, the wealthy merchants, would receive the imported goods from Europe and pay the merchants who arrived with silver or gold. That's basically. No? There was some tobacco, some chocolate at this stage, but it was mainly silver and gold. And then there was the Trans-Pacific trade. That was not conducted by a fleet, because there weren't many privateers or private pirates in the Pacific. There was the Manila galleon. The greatest ship of the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century of the world was the Manila galleon. Most of them could transport 900 tons of products. That was much more than anywhere else. And it would cross from Manila to Acapulco with Chinese goods, Philippine goods, some Indian goods, textiles and ceramics and silks and spices, and exchanged in Acapulco for silver. And the silver would go then back to the Philippines, and then from there to China or to India. So we have global trade there, but it's basically commodities from the Asian world going back for silver from the American world. That's the exchange going on. And this exports of American silver extends practically to all markets in the world, the biggest being China. Now we can go on to world circulation of Mexican and Peruvian. Now, how much silver was going out in the age of the most exports, with the 18th century? Alexander von Humboldt calculated that in the best age, in the best moments, 43 million pesos in minted silver and gold coins left the Americas for Europe. Now, that's the equivalent of $43 million in 1790, because the peso was equivalent to the dollar, which had just been invented. Actually, the dollar's on the basis of the silver peso. Now, 43 million pesos or dollars at that time was a huge amount of money, and it's going out every year. And it travels to Europe, but then from Europe, the silver and the gold grow through from Scandinavia to Russia, where it was in great demand. Another 4 million from Italy to the Levant, to Middle East, to the Ottoman Empire. while another 17 million went to India and China. These are calculations by Alexander von Humboldt, who was the greatest scientist of the world in 1830, in early 18th century. As you know, the greatest universities of Germany are named after Guillermo and Alexander von Humboldt. And he traveled all over the Americas, and he collected information. And the first thing he did when he went to Mexico was to go to the mint to see how they minted the money, and then made all the calculations and got all the statistics. He estimated that around 18 million pesos remained in Europe and fed the monetary circulation within the European countries. At that time, there wasn't much paper money in Europe. There was very little. Bank of England was printing some paper money, and the Bank of Holland. But basically, money in Europe was metallic, silver and gold coins, and some copper, a little. And then Humboldt also added that from during the 18th century, about 2 to 4 million pesos were sent per year from Mexico to the Philippines and thereon to China. Well, these numbers are hotly debated among historians today. There are all kinds of discussions. We also mentioned Flynn and Giraldez. They've discussed the figures, but almost every month now, there's some article that's coming out about the circulation of silver and gold in the world in this period, because it's being found that this was of enormous importance. Now we can go on here, and you can see the trend. Silver and gold in the early 16th century, well, it was quite little, but it was worth more. Silver pesos in the 16th century were worth more than at the end of the 18th century. But nonetheless, you see the trend. The trend is climbing. That was not the story told by Earl Hamilton, who was the great monetary historian of the 16th century, who talked about silver and gold as the origins of the price revolution and of capitalism in the 16th century. He said that was the great age, the 17th century, 16th century, and early 17th century. But actually, we find that gold and silver exported from the Americas increased pretty steadily throughout the colonial period. Well, that's a kind of a summary of silver and gold. Now let's go on to the other products sent from the Americas, tropical exports. These were also very important. The tropical exports from the Americas as the other side of the export commodity story of early globalization. Now, something that's normally forgotten is that the first tropical commodity from the Americas was not sugar, but pau-brasil, Brazil wood, a dye wood, which the Portuguese found in the forests of the Atlantic coast of Brazil, which is also known as La Mata Atlântica, from as early as 1500. 1501 is the first shipment of this timber. The core of the Brazil wood was a red dye, was useful to produce a red dye, and it was sent off to Europe, where it was sent to the textile centers of proto-globalization, of proto-industrialization. You may recall that in the 16th century, in Europe, there were all kinds of textile centers. They're not factories, really. They're just big establishments, artisanal big establishments, producing textiles, luxury goods and common goods. But the luxury goods had the highest prices, and they required very good quality dyes. Now, this story of the American natural dyes is forgotten, but it's coming back in. And the Brazil wood, which was just cut down by the Portuguese using Indian labor, the Indian population in the forests of the Atlantic coast were used to cut down the trees, and they were paid with trinkets and with knives and with axes and with some alcohol and so forth. And this timber was a very highly demanded product. Also, there was logwood from Central America, which is later, a little bit later. There's cochineal from Brazil, from Mexico. There's indigo from the Caribbean and from Central America. In Spain, it's known as añil, but it's indigo is the blue. The pau-brasil gives you a red dye, The cochineal gives you a red dye. That most expensive was the cochineal. The indigo gives you a blue dye, and the logwood gives you a black dye. Now, this corresponds often to demand. For instance, the church wanted black for the priests' uniforms, and also the Habsburg Empire used black a lot. No, but blue was very popular among the French monarchy, and the red was popular everywhere among the kings and the aristocracy. But it was very expensive. So these dye woods coming from the Americas, that's from 1500 to the late 19th century, this dye woods are being exported of other types of dyes, was essential to the European textile industry. That's part of globalization, of early globalization, the connection between dyes and textiles, natural goods, which are useful for dyeing, and the textile industries of Europe, the proto-globalization, before the Industrial Revolution. But even after the Industrial Revolution, the textile industries in Europe are acquiring natural dyes from the Americas. Now, a second important product was sugar. Sugar was being produced in Cuba and Hispaniola by the Spanish from the 1530s. But above all, it began to be produced in Northeast Brazil from the 1540s, where it still is cultivated on a large scale today. So the whole sugar business began then in 1540s. Another local product was tobacco, used by the native peoples of Mexico and South America. Well, an interesting fact is that tobacco is not a recent thing. Archaeological finds indicate that humans in the Americas began using tobacco as far back as 12,000 years ago, which is just amazing. So the famous Virginia tobacco is actually very old, But there was also tobacco in Mexico, and then tobacco was being cultivated in the 16th century in the Caribbean, because during the pre-Hispanic period, the products like tobacco and maize were circulating all over the Americas. In other words, there's trade before early globalization within the Americas. But that's a subject that would be useful to look at another time. The archaeologists are the ones who are finding this it's an interesting subject. Tobacco was introduced into Europe by the 1530s and used not only for pleasure, but as a medicine and as a painkiller for earache and toothache, and introduced to Japan in 1542 by the Portuguese and to the Ottoman Empire in the late 16th century. Well, what does that tell us? Early globalization. These products from the Americas are fueling consumption, demand, trade all over the world. So this is one of the reasons why finding America and exploiting these natural resources is of enormous interest to understand early globalization. Now, the next subject is related to this, which is the slave trade, because all of these tropical products are produced on plantations or on medium-sized establishments by slaves. Why? Well, you may have had reference to the demographic catastrophe of the 16th century. Most of the Indian population in the Americas died in the 16th century. At the first stages because of the conflicts and wars, but during the 16th century, there were so many plagues that most of the population died. In Mexico, 20% survived. In the Caribbean, maybe 5% of the Indian population survived. In South America, maybe 20-30% survived. But the rest of the population died out. And so when they set up, the Spaniards and the Portuguese set up plantations, they needed labor. There wasn't enough labor in the Americas. America was one of the underpopulated areas of the world in the late 16th century. And so they began bringing slaves over from Africa. This was the greatest migration, forced migration of the world until that period. So this is part of early globalization. It's calculated that 12 million slaves were brought from Africa to the Americas between 1520 and 1850, over 3 centuries and a half. There was this is the great forced migration. The other migration was of Europeans going to Spanish America and to Brazil, which was Europeans, and To Spanish America, it's calculated maybe 500,000 Europeans went between 1500 and 1800, much less than the number of slaves. And to Brazil, it's the same story. It's maybe 20% of the number of slaves, of Europeans actually going over. This would change in the 19th century, obviously, as the slave trade is abolished. In the 19th century, we'll find great migration of Europeans on a more free basis. But in any case, if we look at the trends of slavery in the 18th century, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, we'll see that the 18th century was the age of most intense slave traffic. And this is because this is the age of great export of tropical commodities: sugar, tobacco, coffee, chocolate, indigo, all of these commodities which are produced in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, produced all over Spanish America, produced in Brazil, but also in the 18th century by the 13 colonies, the southern colonies, the southern United States. And this trade was described by Eric Williams, the great economic historian of Trinidad, in terms of the triangular trade of the 1700s. Now, you'll see in the map what is a triangular trade between the West Indies, the 13 colonies of the Anglo-American colonies, and Africa. But that's one possible triangle. You'll see sugar and molasses going from the West Indies to Boston, Newport, and so forth, New York, rum going from there to Africa, and slaves going back to the Caribbean. But we could do another triangle, which we don't have a map for, but another triangle would be the West Indies to Great Britain, and then Britain to Africa. And what would happen there? Sugar and molasses to England. England sends off textiles and arms, weapons to Western Africa, and basically Nigeria and the Gold Coast. And then British merchants would tend to take slaves from there to Jamaica and Barbados and the rest of the Caribbean. And then there's another possible triangle, which is the one that goes from the French colonies in the Caribbean, Saint-Domingue, which would later be Haiti, which would be sending sugar and coffee and indigo to France, and then France would be sending textiles and other products to West Africa, and from there the French merchant slave traders would take the slaves to the Caribbean, and they took over 1 million slaves to Haiti, and some to Martinique and Guadeloupe. Haiti became the great slave state, sugar producer and plantation economy in the 18th century. There's another triangle, which is that goes from Brazil, sugar being sent to Portugal, and Portugal sending off textiles and weapons and so forth to West Africa. And then from West Africa, the Portuguese merchants would take slaves to Brazil. So there's a great series of triangles in the Atlantic world, and the most intense commerce, international commerce in the world, was in the Atlantic world in the 18th century. So this is very interesting. Now we can go on to Africa and the slave trade. You can see the great export of slaves in the 18th century, moving from Western Africa and depopulating Africa. Now, how was this done? The Portuguese and the Dutch and the British and the French set up factories. They called them factories, which were like colonies on the coasts with forts, and they would negotiate with local kingdoms, which were dedicated to going into the interior of Africa and capturing Africans and putting them onto the slave ships. We can go to the slave ship. Now you'll see on the left-hand side a slave ship, a typical slave ship, and the conditions in which presumably they were. Many slaves died. About a calculation is between 15 and 20% of the slaves who were sent on the many thousands of vessels died because of sanitary conditions and the spread of disease and so forth. On the right-hand side, you see a great slave ship, which and you'll see at the end of the ship some bodies being thrown overboard. You know, where the part of the front part of the ship. And what is happening there? Well, what's happening is that the owner of the vessel, the merchant captain, is throwing slaves all overboard to drown them. It may be because they're sick and he doesn't want them to sicken all the other slaves. It may be because there is a privateer coming close and he wants to get rid of his cargo. But in any case, this is a terrible story of the slave trade. Now we can go on to the slave population of the Americas. Here, people have been studying the slave populations and slave trade for quite a while now. There are several excellent websites, and I think that some of our colleagues at Pennsylvania can send you some of the information of the websites that Klein and other people have set up. They're great statistical sources, and this is a map built on that, on those websites where economic and demographic historians have collaborated. And you may notice that in 1800, which is the white circles, there are as many slaves in southern United States as in the British West Indies or the French West Indies. And then there are lesser numbers in Cuba and in other Spanish American countries. So the big concentrations are in the French West Indies, the British West Indies, and the southern United States. And this also reflects the number of slave traders. The slave traders, the biggest ones were French, British, and the United States traders, and the Dutch and the Portuguese. You can see a yellow circle up on the left-hand side, and this is the number of slaves in 1860, which is 3,700,000. Well, it turns out that slaves survived better in the United States in the early 18th century, 19th century, because the slave owners no longer could get the slaves from Africa. So they promoted the marriage of Black and men and women to have many children. They wanted them to have children. And so the slave population of the United States between 1800 and 1860 increases quite rapidly. Whereas in the Spanish America, this is not so the case. So there's a lot of discussion. There's discussion that says that, you know, slaves were better off in the United States. Well, that's a debate. Now go to the next graph, please, map. And we'll see down in South America, in Brazil, we have 347,000 at the end of the 18th century. We have in the northern part of Brazil, in the interior part of Brazil, 238, in the southern part, 143. So we have a number here equivalent more or less to how many were in the southern United States. And then the numbers drop off in other countries. But what happened to the slaves? Well, basically, we have a process of liberation after 1801. Who took the lead? The Haitians. The Black slaves in Haiti led the foundation of the first independent state in Latin America, if we can call it that way. 1801, Haiti gains its independence because the Black slaves rebelled. They carry out a revolution, and they fight against the French colonists. Napoleon had come into power in 1798, and he sends over 60,000 troops to Haiti to try to dominate all these rebellious Black Haitians. He fails. Most of the 60,000 troops that were sent over to Haiti died as a result of tropical fevers, and Haiti became independent. What happened with the slaves in other parts of the Americas? Well, in 1810, there was independence wars begin in Argentina, Chile, and Venezuela. Slaves are liberated by Bolivar, San Martin, and other independence leaders so that the slaves could join the armies. In 1830s, slaves are liberated in the British West Indies after a tremendous struggle. The abolitionists win in Great Britain and eliminate slavery in the West Indies, although eliminate is a strong word. The slaves became basically peons on the plantations. They weren't living in great conditions from the 1830s. There's better than being slaves. They couldn't be killed by their owners, or but they had difficult conditions. In the 1850s, Peru and Colombia liberate slaves. In 1864, 63, 64, 65, as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation by Lincoln, slaves are liberated in the United States, basically as a result of the end of the Civil War. And slaves become free in the southern United States, and they're given powers to vote. Unfortunately, Reconstruction ends around 1880, and the white population, elite population of the southern states of the United States, took away the voting rights of blacks from 1880s on. No? So this is a story very much related to Black Lives Matter. That really happened as a consequence, the taking away of liberties won in the Civil War in the 1880s by the Southern plantation elite. It was in the 1880s also that slavery is abolished in Brazil, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. That's the end of slavery in the Americas. In the 1880s, long time it took to get rid of slavery. In Brazil and Cuba and Puerto Rico, then, we have this process in the 1880s. And that marks the end of the slave economies in the Americas. No? But the tropical economies continue. No? So there's modern studies focus a lot on studies of haciendas and plantations after the 1880s. Now we're going to move on to a related subject, but somewhat different, and want to do this as fast as I can. We talked before about silver as a commodity, as a monetary commodity, but silver being the most important export of the Spanish America and gold of Brazil for a long time, was also important as an instrument of imperial finance from the 16th century. So this is a complement. It's part of early globalization. Early globalization is commodity economies, but it's also imperial economies. And these imperial economies were run by monarchies, which had great armies, and they fought, and navies, and fought among each other. And they needed to finance wars. From the early 16th century, the Spanish Habsburg Emperor, Charles V, is involved in wars with many other powers in Europe. Now, what was the importance of American silver to him, gold and silver? Well, he needed to finance these wars. And one of the ways he did so was to rely on his bankers. And the most important banker of Charles V was Jacob Fouquer of Augsburg, Germany, the wealthiest banker in the world in the 16th century. And he provides Charles V with loans because he has promised the silver that Cortes is sending, Hernan Cortes is sending from Mexico. And that money actually ends up in the hands of Fouquer. No? Now, the next Spanish emperor, Philip II, relied mainly on Genoese bankers. Those Genoese bankers from the time of Columbus were all involved in financing the Spanish-American trades. And they helped finance the attempted invasion of England by the Spanish Armada in 1587. Philip III and Philip IV, who followed Philip II, financed the 30 Years' War with silver from the Americas. And much of that was financed by Portuguese bankers of Jewish origin, who were operating out of Lisbon, but also out of Amsterdam. These wars are big wars, the 30 Years' Wars of the 17th century. Now, after that, there's a period of relative, well, there's no peace in Europe. There's always wars, and always the American silver and gold is important. But I would go now into the 18th century because this is a new stage of wars. And it's often forgotten that the 18th century was a period of incredibly intense wars, naval and land wars, but not just between Great Britain and France. Spain was also heavily involved from the wars of Spanish succession in the early 18th century, 1700 to 1712, 12 years of wars, and then the late 18th century, and then the Napoleonic Wars. So early globalization is continuously being affected by wars, international wars. This is a subject which many people have dealt with, many historians in recent times, and has attracted a great amount of attention. And we could mention some of the authors. I mean, Douglas North and Stat Savage and many others, Dickinson. have been working on the amount of silver and gold involved in these international wars. But I would now look at the amount of silver that was sent from Mexico to the Caribbean and to Spain in the 18th century. Here, an interesting graph. It will show you that although a lot of silver is going to Spain, being sent from Mexico, more silver is being sent to the Caribbean. Where? To Cuba, Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico, Trinidad, to protect the garrisons of the Spanish Empire during the 18th century. And that map shows you the flows of silver in the 18th century. A great number going to the Caribbean, because the Caribbean was the key to control of the Spanish Empire in the northern part of the Americas. And as a matter of fact, a lot of this silver was going both to the Spanish colonies, but also to the United States and to Great Britain. An interesting comment. The silver that goes to Great Britain and arrives to Great Britain is accepted by the London Mint. They accept the silver coin. They say the Mexican coins are valid. You'll see the head of Charles IV on this silver peso, this universal coin. But what did the British Mint do? It put a little symbol of George III within that silver peso, and then it circulates, and it goes off to India or to China and many other places. Finally, we should note that apart from going to Great Britain and to Europe, the silver pesos went to the United States. And as a matter of fact, I'd like to end this talk by suggesting to you an interesting subject, which is that the US dollar comes from the silver peso, the Spanish American silver pesos. And you can see this in this, the earliest of the dollars, the paper dollars. And it says, the possessor, this is printed by the state of Massachusetts, but also the Constitutional Congress of the 1780s printed up the money in dollars. And it said that basically the same thing. The possessor of this bill shall be paid two Spanish milled dollars by the 31st day of December 1786, with interest in the money. So this is the first paper money in dollars, printed up by states or by the Constitutional Congress. And how is that? Why is that paper money accepted? It's accepted because the reserve, the currency, is silver pesos. And what kind of silver pesos? Spanish, it says. It's actually Mexican. All the silver pesos were being minted in Mexico. So the early dollar it actually comes from the Mexican silver peso. And it was worth exactly $1, 1 silver peso. And that continued till the 1850s. Well, thank you very much. And I suppose we can go into the questions or discussion if there are any.
Hi, yes. So we have a couple of questions. We have run out of time, but I guess we can at least have one or two. I guess one of the questions was, what were the main goods that came from Spain and Portugal to the New World?
The main goods that were going to the Americas were
Yes.
textiles, always textiles. I mean, textiles have been the most important export good of Europe until about 1914, actually. And then there was a certain amount of wine. There was a certain amount of goods like ham. There were weapons. There was mercury. There was powder. There were many other goods of that kind that was sent off. And among the textiles is not just Spanish textiles. It's also French, British, Flemish, Italian textiles that were sent through Cadiz or through Lisbon to the Americas.
One last question is, how about trade before the discovery of Americas? Were tea and coffee already being consumed in Europe at the time? And how, if any, silver was produced back then?
As far as tea is concerned, tea was not produced in the Americas. Tea is produced in China, basically, and then in India from the 1780s. And tea is consumed in small quantities in Europe from about the 17th century. It began to be really important in the 19th century. Coffee came from, as you know, from Ethiopia and then to the Arabian Peninsula, and then from there to the Ottoman Empire. But it's brought to the Americas in the 18th century, early 18th century, and begins to be a really big export. In the 19th century, it becomes the Brazilian export, and as you know today, coffee is the biggest beverage in the world. No? So that was very important. But it's in the 18th century with the coffee houses, which replaced the chocolate houses in Europe, that these beverages became very popular. Chocolate was more important until 1780 than coffee as a beverage in Europe. But from the 1780s, and particularly the French Revolution and so forth, coffee becomes the major beverage.
Well, okay. Thank you very much for your fantastic talk, Professor. We have come to an end. So let's see you next week when we talk about the period of independence. Thank you, everybody.